Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and when we come away from a review feeling excited and energized about some things, but then baffled and downright disappointed about others, it can mean only one thing: an AMD GPU review. Or two in this case, as we're checking out both the 9070 and the 9070 XT in this video. They've made some bold claims, but today we're going to find out exactly how fast these GPUs are and how they stack up against the Nvidia competition. Just last week then, at long last, AMD finally made things official about its new GPUs, the RX 9070 and the 9070 XT. Launching at $549 and $599 respectively, these GPUs are taking on the likes of Nvidia's RTX 5070 and 5070 Ti, and believe me when I say there is plenty to talk about in this video. First though, let's quickly recap the core spec of these two GPUs. They are pretty similar overall, using the same Navi 48 die, but the 9070 has fewer compute units at 56, giving it 3,584 cores compared to 4,096 of the 9070 XT. The XT also clocks a fair bit higher at 2,970 MHz boost compared to 2,520 MHz boost for the non-XT variant. Both do share identical memory subsystems though, with 16 gigs of GDDR6 memory clocked at 20 gigabits per second, operating over a 256-bit memory interface for total memory bandwidth of 645 gigabytes a second. The XT also has a higher power limit of 304 watts compared to 220 watts for the regular 9070. On the topic of reference specs, it is worth pointing out that there's no official reference card from AMD, instead they are relying solely on their partners for this launch. I decided to test the Sapphire Pulse 9070, and I've also got the ASRock RX 9070 XT Tai Chi model, and I opted for those cards for one reason only, and that is that they come at reference clocks, at least when using the quiet BIOS for the ASRock card. As some of you may know, for my day one GPU reviews, everything I test is done at reference spec, so I don't test any factory overclock cards, so that's the reason why I opted for these two cards today. We're also using our regular GPU test system, which is powered by MSI. This thing is packing in the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D processor. We've got MSI's MPG X870E carbon Wi-Fi motherboard, and that's paired with 64 gigs of Kingston Fury Beast DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, and all testing was done using MSI's MPG 321 URX QD-OLED 4K monitor. It's also finally worth pointing out that in this video I am focusing on 1440p and 4K performance. However, I did also test 1080p, so if you want to see that and every single one of the 212 charts I made for this review, you can do that over in the written review, which is found in the description, and I'll also leave it in the pinned comment. Kicking off our games testing then with Alan Wake 2, it is a strong start for the RX 9070 XT, given it averages 77 FPS, putting it level with the RTX 4080 Super and about 6% ahead of the 5070 Ti at 1440p. The RX 9070 meanwhile hits 68 FPS on average, giving it a strong 17% advantage over the RTX 5070. Up at 4K, we do see some more dubious looking 1% lows from these new RDNA 4 GPUs. The average frame rate of the 9070 XT is still in line with the 4080 Super, but frame times for both cards take a hit. This is definitely something for the Radeon division to iron out with a future driver update. As for Black Myth Wukong, at 1440p, the 9070 XT is within touching distance of the RTX 5070 Ti, while it's also on par with the last gen flagship, the 7900 XTX. The RX 9070 has a much closer fight with the RTX 5070 though, given the RDNA GPU is just 4% faster. At 4K, the XT model can only manage 30 FPS on average, with the non-XT 9070 at 26 FPS, so you definitely want to enable upscaling or drop the quality here for these GPUs. Moving on to Cyberpunk 2077, it feels pretty ironic to me that the 9070 XT is actually 6% faster than the 5070 Ti at 1440p. After all, this game is Nvidia's RTX poster child, and the 9070 is a good 10% faster than the RTX 5070 too. Up at 4K, the 9070 XT is now 10% faster than the 5070 Ti. It's also dead level with the 7900 XTX, with the average frame rate just below 60 FPS, while the 9070 comes in 14% faster than the 5070. Final Fantasy XVI sees the RX 9070 sandwiched between the 4070 Ti Super and the 7900 XT at 1440p, though that works out as a very healthy 15% lead over the 5070. The XT model is also 9% faster than the 5070 Ti. At 4K, the Nvidia GPUs do catch up somewhat, but the performance of the 9070 XT is still right in line with the 5070 Ti and 4080 Super, though the 9070 sees the 1% lows drop below 30 FPS. This next one is really interesting though, as Forza Horizon 5 seems to massively overperform on these new RDNA 4 GPUs. At 1440p, I have the 9070 XT coming in 18% ahead of the 5070 Ti, while the 9070 comes in a whopping 29% faster than the 5070, and those are two of the biggest margins we will see today. Even at 4K, the 9070 XT is still on par with the RTX 5080, with the 9070 now 23% ahead of the 5070, and that is still a huge result for Radeon. Ghost of Tsushima is the other title I test where we saw performance for RDNA 4 far outstrip expectations, given the 9070 XT is 15% faster than the 5070 Ti. The 9070 is also another 28% faster than the 5070 at 1440p, which is not bad at all, considering they're the same price. That margin even increases to 31% at 4K resolution. There is definitely a sense that Blackwell underperforms in this title, but with the 9070 XT 14% faster than the 5070 Ti, these are great results for AMD's new architecture. Now, Horizon Forbidden West is much more favourable to Nvidia GPUs, but even then, at 1440p, there's nothing to split between the 7900 XT, the 9070 XT, and the 5070 Ti. All three hover around the 105 FPS mark. The 9070 also comes in 7% faster than the 5070, while it's a hair ahead of the 7900 XT as well. 60 FPS gaming is comfortably achieved on the 9070 XT at 4K too, where it's only 7% behind the 4080 Super. The non-XT model also comes in 12% faster than the 5070. Moving on to The Last of Us Part 1, this is another good showing for RDNA 4, with the 9070 coming in 20% faster than the 5070 here at 1440p, though compared to RDNA 3, it's just 6% ahead of the 7900 GRE. At 4K, we also see strong performance from the 9070 XT, given it comes in 14% ahead of the 5070 Ti, so it's within touching distance of the 5080, and that is really impressive stuff. A Plague Tale Requiem is another game that typically runs best on Nvidia GPUs, but even then, at 1440p we're still looking at an 8% gain for the 9070 over the 5070, while the 9070 XT is dead level with the 5070 Ti. At 4K, the XT is still within 2% of the 5070 Ti, while its non-XT sibling now takes a 9% lead over the 5070. Next up, we have Senua Saga Hellblade 2, and here the 9070 only trails the 7900 XT and the 4070 Ti Super by 3%, and that works out as a 12% advantage over Nvidia's 5070. At 4K2, the 9070 XT draws level with the 5070 Ti, with both cards hitting 37 FPS on average, but that still works out as a 12% gain over the 7900 XT, while the 9070 delivers a 10% advantage over the 5070. Oddly though, despite being an AMD sponsored title, RDNA 4 seems to underperform in Starfield. We see just a 3% gain, for instance, for the 9070 XT over the 7900 XT, and that makes it 5% slower than the 5070 Ti, while the 9070 is just 5% faster than the 5070. At 4K, the 9070 non-XT still holds a 5% lead over the 5070, while it's the same margin faster than the 7900 GRE. Our last rasterized game of the day then is Total War Warhammer 3, where at 1440p, the 9070 XT looks like great value, equaling the 4080 Super at just under 160 FPS on average. Stepping up to 4K really doesn't change that result though, given the 9070 XT is now 11% slower than the 7900 XTX. Overall then, there is no doubt both the RX 9070 and 9070 XT deliver very impressive rasterization performance. At 1440p, the 9070 XT is bang in line with the 4080 Super, also making it 6% faster than the RTX 5070 Ti across my testing. The 9070 meanwhile holds a strong 15% advantage over the RTX 5070. It is at this point in the review that I do want to stress we always highly recommend you go out and watch or read other reviews to get as much data as possible. We did see some very pronounced swings between Nvidia and AMD depending on the game tested, so depending on the selection of games that have been benchmarked, you could see slightly different results. So as I said, always best to check and read and watch as many other reviews as you can. Up at 4K though, we're still looking at a 6% gain on average for the 9070 XT over the 5070 Ti, while performance is dead level with the 4080 Super. The 9070 also comes in 16% faster than the 5070, while it's 20% faster than the 7900 GRE, which is pretty much in line with AMD's claims. Taking a closer look then at performance versus the RTX 5070 Ti, here we can see the 9070 XT's relative performance compared to its GeForce competitor. We only saw the RDNA 4 GPU come in slower in 3 titles at 1440p and never by more than 5%. 6 of the 12 games tested show single-digit gains for the 9070 XT, while Forza Horizon 5 and Ghost of Tsushima are the clear outliers. However, even if we remove those 2 games from the average, the 9070 XT only goes from being 6% faster on average to being 3% faster on average, so it really doesn't affect the outcome in any meaningful way. As for the 9070 versus the 5070, I didn't see a single instance where the RDNA 4 GPU proved slower, though 5 of the 12 games tested saw single-digit improvements. If we again remove Forza Horizon 5 and Ghost of Tsushima from the average, the 9070 only goes from being 15% faster on average to being 11% faster on average, so again, I don't think that's enough to really change the overall picture. As for all of that means then for value, at the time of filming I only have confirmed US pricing, so any calculations using British pounds will have to wait. Still, the trends are very clear when using the US MSRPs, as these new RDNA 4 GPUs are the market leaders for rasterization value. At 1440p for instance, cost per frame of the 9070 XT is 17% lower than the RTX 5070 and 25% better than the 5070 Ti. However, the elephant in the room is that the 9070 is actually delivering worse value than the 9070 XT. AMD has once again priced this card far too close to its more expensive sibling. The 9070 really needed to be $100 cheaper than the 9070 XT, at which point it would be 17% cheaper but only 12% slower. Right now it's just 8% cheaper for being 12% slower, so that really does not make any sense. So we've seen the picture when looking at rasterization performance, but what about ray tracing? Starting things off then with Alan Wake 2, at 1440p, Nvidia is still the clear winner here. The 9070 XT is only on par with the RTX 4070, making it 42% slower than the 5070 Ti, while the 9070 can't even keep the frame rate above 30 FPS. Still, AMD has made huge strides in this regard, given that both RDNA 4 cards are miles faster than the 7900 XTX, but it's just not enough to get close to the GeForce competition. The same goes for Black Myth Wukong, though do bear in mind these are path trace settings here in this title and in Alan Wake 2, with non-path trace ray tracing performance still to come. Even so, performance is worse for RDNA 4 in this title, with both models well behind the RTX 4070 and even slower than the 3080 Ti. Again, the gains over RDNA 3 are huge, with the 9070 XT showing a 51% uplift over the 7900 XTX, but it's still not enough for Radeon to be competitive. That changes in Cyberpunk 2077 though, where we are using RT Ultra settings and not the path-traced RT Overdrive mode. Here, the 9070 XT delivers 50 FPS on average at 1440p, making it just 11% slower than the 5070 Ti, while the 9070 is just 5% behind the RTX 5070, so it is slower, but those are much more competitive results than what we've seen so far. F124 even sees both AMD cards overtake their Nvidia rivals. The 9070 XT is only 5% faster than the 5070 Ti for instance, and this game does tend to run much better on Radeon GPUs anyway, but that is still a massive achievement for AMD, with the 9070 coming in no less than 17% faster than the 5070. Ratchet Clank though is much more of a struggle for RDNA 4, with the XT coming in 26% slower than the 5070 Ti, while the non-XT is 18% behind the 5070. Again, both are faster than the 7900 XTX, which is another indicator of the clear strides RDNA 4 has made for ray tracing performance compared to its predecessors. As for Returnal, this one is much lighter on ray tracing features, but that means the 9070 is basically level with the 5070, while we see the RDNA 4 flagship coming in only 8% slower than the 5070 Ti. As for Shadow of the Tomb Raider, here we again find smaller generational gains on show, given this title only utilises ray trace shadows, though overall frame rates are still very playable with image quality maxed out. Star Wars Outlaws is a much more surprising positive note for RDNA 4, however. Performance is basically a draw between the 9070 XT and the 5070 Ti at 1440p, while the 9070 is no less than 12% faster than the 5070, and that is not bad at all, considering this game uses ray tracing as a fundamental part of its engine. Overall then, over the 8 games tested, there is no doubt RDNA 4 has improved ray tracing performance significantly. It seems like the more ray tracing is being done, the bigger the gains, as we saw in Alan Wake 2 and Black Myth Wukong, where the 9070 XT was some 50% faster than the 7900 XTX. Unfortunately, those are also the games where Nvidia shows its dominance in this segment, and as such, the 9070 XT is still the slower card for ray tracing overall, losing out to the 5070 Ti by 15% on average at 1440p, while the 9070 comes in 6% slower than the RTX 5070. We do need to spend some time talking about FSR 4, however, and while I can't spend as much time as I would like to in this video, otherwise we'd be here for hours upon hours, it is a huge improvement over FSR 3.1, and I really wanted to touch on that as part of this day one review. The first thing you need to know about FSR 4 is that this is AMD's new ML-based upscaler, and as such, it is currently exclusive to RDNA 4 GPUs. Rather than being natively supported in games, right now it's actually enabled by a toggle in the driver, and that will override select FSR 3.1 games and upgrade them to FSR 4, kind of not dissimilar to Nvidia's override tool in the Nvidia app. In this video then, I'm just going to look at a few select image quality comparisons, all tested at 4K, but using the FSR performance mode, which uses a 1080p internal resolution. I also have some comparisons against Nvidia and DLSS, specifically DLSS 4, which I upgraded to the latest transformer model, as that's really setting the standard for upscaling in 2025. The first thing to point out though is that there's really no doubt image quality is vastly better than with FSR 3.1. In Ratchet Clank, for instance, one of the first thing I looked for was the confetti in this early scene. With FSR 3.1, it kind of disappears due to a lack of pixel information, but that is no problem for FSR 4, where the density of said confetti is vastly superior. You'll also notice the holographic rings around these characters as they kind of float away. It looks all garbled and fizzly on FSR 3.1, but again, that's fixed and cleaned up with FSR 4. I also compared the jet boosters on these floating platforms, with FSR 4 removing the distorted and kind of crunchy looking effect that we see on FSR 3.1, while there's a lot less shimmering and far more overall detail on the metallic spires here too. Back to the confetti though, here you can see it going round and round in this circular machine thingy. That gets totally garbled and blurred into one when using FSR 3.1, but again, that is completely cleaned up with FSR 4. It's hard to overstate just how much better character detail is reconstructed when in motion too. Just look at the fizzling, pixelated look on FSR 3.1 that is drastically cleaned up with FSR 4. In fact, I'm actually having a really hard time spotting the difference between FSR 4 and DLSS 4 in this comparison. Both look seriously clean, and that is great news for FSR. I even noticed a couple of occasions where FSR 4 is arguably better than DLSS 4, like when looking at the temporal stability of this barbed wire in The Last of Us Part 1, though in the same scene, the text on this sign is definitely sharper when using DLSS. Both look very similar in motion in Horizon Forbidden West 2. DLSS I'd say probably preserves more detail here, though it arguably looks a touch too sharp for my liking, but there's no doubt FSR 4 has come on hugely, and this is great news for AMD. I'm going to leave the image quality comparisons there, otherwise we would be here for hours, but it is quickly worth pointing out that FSR 4 does come at an increased cost over FSR 3.1. In Ratchet & Clank, for instance, frame rates dropped by 8 FPS compared to FSR 3.1, or to put it another way, the cost of using a 1080p to 4K upscale is 19% versus native 1080p on FSR 3.1, but a 25% cost on FSR 4. It's only a small difference though, and absolutely worth it for the huge increase in image quality on show, and either way, performance is still miles better than what you'd get at native 4K. Time to move on to the graphics cards themselves though. As mentioned, we are using the Sapphire Pulse 9070 and the ASRock Taichi 9070 XT. Starting off with the Pulse, it is very much a continuation of the design from the previous generation. We get a matte black plastic shroud that has some red accents. It's also using a dual fan cooler, while Sapphire has outfitted a metal backplate with a flow-through area at the end. Power is supplied by dual 8-pin connectors, so nothing controversial there. As for the Tai Chi, this one is a bit more eye-catching, I'd say, with its triple fan cooler with a grey and black shroud that is sporting some gold accents. The central fan is also rocking translucent fan blades to help with the RGB bling, and it certainly looks good once powered on. The backplate is also a tidy bit of work, complete with various cogs and wheels painted in gold. The card also features dual BIOS as well, with a choice of the performance or quiet modes. Interestingly though, ASRock has opted for a 12V 2x6 connector, and this has proved very controversial on the likes of the RTX 5090. However, I did whip out my current clamp and didn't find any issues seeing 4.2 to 4.3 amps on all 6 12V wires and about 26 amps total, which checks out given the TBP of over 300 watts. The connector temperatures as well were nothing to worry about, sitting in the mid to low 50s, while the cable itself was even cooler. Ultimately, power draw is low enough that I'm not too worried about any issues here, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on. As for GPU temperatures of these two cards then, we saw all three results when testing both BIOS modes on the Tai Chi, sitting at below 60 degrees on the GPU. Hotspot temperatures were a bit higher, especially on the ASRock Tai Chi, where we saw a fairly large delta between the GPU and hotspot metrics, perhaps indicating suboptimal mounting pressure or baseplate flatness. Memory temperatures are also pretty high across the board, hitting either 88 degrees or 92 degrees. Now, these cards are using Hynix memory, and I had a look, but I couldn't see an official maximum temperature on their website anywhere. I would have to test more cards to see if it's just these two particular models which are running that bit hotter. I'd imagine those temperatures are still well within safe limits, but we will have to see how other partner cards stack up. The good news though is that both cards are very, very quiet. Funnily enough, both BIOS modes on the Tai Chi actually saw the fan speeds hit the same 20% or 940 RPM fan speed. Usually the performance or gaming mode runs a little bit louder, but that's not the case here. The Sapphire Pulse also ran at just 22% fan speed, which was 930 RPM, making it virtually inaudible. Time to move on to power draw, however, and as a reminder, here we actually use Nvidia's PCAT tool to measure power draw of the graphics card only on a per game, per resolution basis. That means if you want to see the power draw of these two cards in every single game we tested, either with or without ray tracing, you can do so over in the written article. I'm going to keep things a bit more simpler, however, in this video just for the sake of time, and we're going to focus on the 1440p average results. Looking at the 12 game average then at 1440p, the Tai Chi pulled 320 watts on average over the 12 games tested. The reference TBP is 304 watts, and while the Tai Chi does have a reference clock speed of 2970 MHz when using its quiet BIOS, it seems like ASRock has still increased the native power draw, either that or it was just consistently exceeding TBP. The Sapphire Pulse, however, was bang on with its own TBP rating of 220 watts, drawing 218.9 watts on average over my testing, and I didn't see any real change for either card when stepping up to 4K too. As for what that means in terms of efficiency then, the 9070 XT is very middling, nothing to write home about, with just a 7% improvement to performance per watt over the 7900 GRE. The 9070 though, non-XT, delivers efficiency that is the best in its class, only fractionally behind the RTX 5080. That means AMD's GPU leads the RTX 5070 by 8% when it comes to performance per watt, and it works out as a 37% improvement over the 7900 GRE, which was one of RDNA 3's most efficient GPUs. In fact, at 4K, I almost could not believe my eyes. The 9070 is actually the most efficient GPU we have ever tested. Not by much, but it sneaks in with a 4% lead over the RTX 5080, while that increases to a 14% advantage over the 5070. This really is highly impressive stuff from AMD. We absolutely love to see it, and I hope this trend continues with the other RDNA 4 GPUs we will see in the future. So that is it for all of our testing as part of this review, and it's time to wrap things up. There's no doubt that both GPUs are very strong, but my final conclusions do end up being quite different for each of these two cards, so I'm going to get the negativity out of the way first and talk about the 9070 non-XT. Quite simply, while it looks good in isolation, I just have no idea what AMD is doing pricing this thing at $549. For one, that works out as worse value than the 9070 XT, given that GPU is only 9% more expensive, yet 14% faster on average at 1440p, so the 9070 doesn't even make sense against its own family member. On top of that, I just don't see how AMD can price this at the exact same price point as the RTX 5070. Yes, the 9070 is a good chunk faster for rasterization, it offers more VRAM and comes close overall for ray tracing, but my concern is that the average consumer is only going to see two 70 class cards at the same price and simply default to Nvidia because it's the much more established brand. To be blunt, we all know this GPU should be $499, and I do not doubt for a second it will quickly drop to that price point. However, once again, AMD has simply stuffed up its own launch day reviews by setting the price too high out of the gate. The RX 9070 XT, however, is a very strong contender at the $599 price point, and I think it could be just what the market needs. After all, rasterization performance is highly competitive with the 5070 Ti, a GPU that's MSRP is $150 higher and simply cannot be bought at that price right now. Ray tracing has also come on hugely, with gains of up to 50% over the 7900 XTX, with the RDNA 4 architecture seeing its biggest improvements in super heavy ray traced or path tracing games. However, those are also the titles where Nvidia is at its strongest, as the 9070 XT still trails the RTX 5070 Ti by margins of 40 to 50% in path trace titles, including Alan Wake 2 and Black Myth Wukong. So while there's no denying that RDNA 4 is a huge step forward in this regard, I also can't help but feel that Nvidia is still the obvious choice if you want to enable high fidelity ray tracing, especially considering the increasing number of path trace games that are launching to the market. FSR 4 though is another huge positive for AMD, with this new ML based algorithm delivering substantial improvements to image quality when compared to FSR 3.1. It even holds its own against Nvidia's DLSS 4 transformer model in the few examples I looked at, though further analysis really is required beyond what I was capable of today. AMD, however, really does need to continue to work hard and improve game support though. It's great that titles supporting FSR 3.1 can be upgraded to FSR 4 via the Adrenalin driver, but that's still a relatively small proportion of games out there, especially when you compare the number of titles that support DLSS Super Resolution. Overall though, this GPU has clearly met its goal of offering highly compelling value up against the RTX 5070 Ti for rasterization, considering it comes with a 25% reduction to cost per frame. That is a terrific result for AMD and something that will appeal to a lot of PC gamers right now. Still, as good as it is, I don't think the RX 9070 XT has quite struck a decisive knockout blow against the RTX 5070 Ti. Yes, it has improved hugely in terms of both ray tracing and FSR upscaling, but as mentioned, the 5070 Ti is still the stronger overall choice if you value ray tracing, while DLSS Super Resolution has a much wider foothold in the market than FSR. Nvidia also has the benefit of stronger AI performance, especially in our large language model benchmarks, while the 5070 Ti is also the more efficient GPU. However, credit where credit is due, the RX 9070 XT is a very strong contender in this market segment and shows real improvement versus RDNA 3. Let's hope that prices stay as close to MSRP as possible, as this could be exactly what the GPU market needs right now. Anyway guys, that is where I'm going to leave this video, so if you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Please do subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to ding that notification bell so you don't miss when we upload a new video. If you want to carry on the conversation as well, you can find a link to our Discord server down in the description, and while you're there, you can also find a link to our merch store where you can pick up a cool t-shirt like one of these on screen. Lastly, if you're feeling particularly generous, you could also help us out by backing us on Patreon. That's it for this one though guys, I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.